Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask, please, that my written statement and 2 attachments be included for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Issa, members of the distinguished committee, in 1991, I wrote a book called A State of Risk: Will Government-Sponsored Enterprises Be the Next Financial Crisis? And then worked with a small group of reformers, including Congressman Jake Pickle of the House Ways and Means Committee, Democrat of Texas, and Representative Bill Gradison of Ohio, Republican. We tried to improve federal regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and their safety and soundness, but because of very strong lobbying by those 2 organizations, the regulator was created without adequate authority. In my testimony today, I'd like to make 3 basic points. 1, while Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did not cause the mortgage credit debacle, they did engage in risky practices that turned them into sources of vulnerability rather than strength for the mortgage market and the larger economy. 2, as it becomes clear that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in fact are insolvent, it would help to place them into receivership and thereby remove private shareholders from the 2 failed companies. Once shareholders are clearly gone, the next administration can use the 2 companies to provide much-needed support and reform, including consumer protections, for the home mortgage market. If the companies remain in conservatorship rather than receivership, then government will face conflicting objectives about the role of the 2 companies in serving urgent public purposes versus serving financial interests of the companies and their shareholders. 3, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should not be restored to their previous status as privately owned organizations that operate with pervasive federal backing. The 2 companies and their powerful constituencies have consistently fought for higher leverage and against effective accountability. Even if a strong regulator were created initially, and somebody mentioned the concept of public utility regulation, the political power of the 2 companies can be expected to weaken accountability over time and restore the companies to their dominant market positions, high leverage, and financial vulnerability. Let me briefly talk about the first point and leave the rest for discussion. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac committed serious misjudgments that helped to bring about their insolvency. The most serious of these misjudgments involved the company's resistance to accepting more effective supervision and capital standards. For years, the 2 companies exerted their influence to fend off capital standards that would have reduced their excessive leverage and absorbed potential losses. The 2 companies compounded the problem by taking on excessive risk just at the point that housing prices were peaking. Among other losing assets, the 2 companies held over $200 billion of private label mortgage-related securities backed by Alt-A or subprime mortgages in 2007. In making these mistakes, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac revealed the inherent vulnerabilities of the government-sponsored enterprise, or GSE, as an organizational model. First, the GSE can live or die according to its charter and other laws that determine the condition under which it operates. That means GSEs select their chief officers in good part based on ability to manage political risk, as we saw in the first panel today, rather than on their ability to manage 2 of the largest financial institutions in the world. Second, GSEs combine private ownership with government backing in a way that creates a virtually unstoppable political force. Because of their government backing and low capital requirements, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac gained immense market power. They doubled in size every 5 years or so, until this year the 2 companies funded over $5 trillion of mortgages, about 40% of the mortgage market. Their market power gave them political power, which is seen in the fact that the new regulator created by the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008, enacted late July just before the companies collapsed, still failed to give the new regulator the full mandate, authority, or discretion over safety and soundness and systemic risk that is available to the federal bank regulators. And if there's a question on this, I'd be delighted to submit documentation to the record. In short, the mix of private incentives and government backing created a dynamic that led not only to the hubris that brought about the meltdown of internal controls at both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac several years ago, but also their insolvency in 2008. But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac by themselves did not cause the housing bubble or the proliferation of subprime and other mortgages that borrowers could not afford to repay. In analyzing the two companies, I discovered a phenomenon that can be called Stanton's Law. Risk will migrate to the place where government is least equipped to deal with it. So the capital markets arbitraged across regulatory requirements and ultimately sent trillions of dollars of mortgages to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where capital requirements were low and federal supervision was weak. But the capital markets also found other places where government could not manage the risk and also sent huge volumes of subprime, Alt-A, interest-only, and other toxic mortgages to structured investment vehicles of commercial banks, private securitization conduits, and collateralized debt obligations that were virtually unsupervised. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to end on a note about the human costs of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Their actions led to hundreds of thousands of American families and possibly more than 1 million facing delinquency and default on their mortgages and potential foreclosure of their homes. They funded the overbuilding of hundreds of thousands of homes that will be vacant or boarded up because no one wants to live there. The cost to the American taxpayer will run potentially to hundreds of billions of dollars. All of this harm occurred on the watch of the 4 men on the first panel. It could have been avoided with prudent lending, prudent capital, and prudent management. So thank you again for holding this important hearing on two financial institutions that use their high leverage and insatiable appetites to grow to an unmanageable size before they failed. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions.